behind the cloak. And if you stay in the mist, you gon' be soaked. So listen up, cause this hair of the dog, what's real, what ain't? Is this the fog or smog? Cause there's a difference when you breathe it in. So don't let the corporate media take you for a spin. This that morning show, they put you in the know. So I hope that you ready, cause all we do is go, go, go. Yeah, come get your info, you gon' be like, whoa. Hair of the dog, we bout that, ayy. We in the zone, we out here, yeah. Speeding the facts.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Hair of the Dog. I'm Andy Kennedy, and it is a beautiful Wednesday morning and a great day to be alive. And again, that means a lot more than it used to. We have a pretty serious show for you today. It's going to be have a little bit of an international flavor to it. But before we get to the main part of our broadcast today, we have a little bit of housekeeping to do. But before we can get to that, that requires me to introduce my lovely and talented co-host, Ms. Carrie Barber. Good morning, Carrie. How are you?
Hey, Andy. Good morning. I feel like I was in Ottawa yesterday, so it was the most bizarre thing. We had 60-degree weather, and then within 2 hours, it started snowing, and I mean snowing, like accumulation on the ground. I was like, oh, this is weird. So maybe this is my first spring in New Mexico, in the high desert. So maybe this is a thing. I don't know, but
well, it didn't used to be a thing.
Right.
We've got that jet stream now that is behaving badly because of the polar vortex. We had that show that explained why I refer to Texas as Canada South. It's scary, and there's still all those people in the southern Midwest and the West Coast and right across to Florida that are now in danger of going through below zero temperatures. And I would gather that 95+% of those people aren't protected or prepared for any weather like that. So we're only going to see this another off spin of what we've done to our climate. Shout out to all those people that are climate deniers that still don't have water in Texas.
Exactly. And I think what I'm starting to hear is those voices who are in outright denial are starting to get a little bit quieter, and they've switched to, well, what are we going to do because I work in oil and gas or fracking or whatever? How am I going to live? What are you going to do for me? And I got mine. So I guess on one hand, it's a bit of a positive step forward. But first, those are valid questions. Second, remember when you were talking about the Green New Deal and laughing about cow flatulence? Right. Well, you missed the part where there's job training, and we want you to continue working and taking all those great skills that you built in the oil and gas industry, and we want you to work in green energy and sustainability. So there's a place for you. And
of course there is. We have to remember, as progressives, we're working towards a more just society for everyone, right? Not just progressives, not just quote unquote Dems. This is going to benefit everyone in our society. The reason that you're against that is because of the dog whistles and gaslighting that's been done to you by American propaganda for your entire life, right? But we want to try to meet you over a fence somewhere and try to have a civil conversation about why this change helps everyone, right? That the bootstrap argument, that the rugged individualism argument, that you can't have nice things argument because America is broke. Let us explain to you why that's not the case, right? And then, first of all, everybody gets a vote, and then they all rise together. Right.
And not like the trickle down argument. I mean, this is really, we will all rise or fall together.
Yes. We actually just a little quick side note. I know we've got a pretty hefty show to get to today, Carrie, but this week's Macaroni and Cheese is with a with an Italian economist who's a very interesting gentleman. I believe that you've heard of Thomas Fassi, who's originally from the UK but lives in Italy, and he penned an article back in the very beginning days of COVID, right? And it was really interesting article because a lot of things that he was asking, those questions and the answers that he was suggesting ring true now a year out, right? Like and then the title of the article was, is COVID-19 mean the death of capitalism, right? And why that's relevant and what it means going forward, and showing how tenuous a grasp on the narrative the neoliberal capitalists actually have now, right? With people becoming more aware, not only because they're starting to get curious and do the legwork of actually understanding their world around them, but because they're struggling to keep a roof over their head or feed their families, right? And all of this is in this article, and it's a very interesting podcast that's being released on Saturday with this gentleman. So I'd suggest anybody that's that understands or has read anything about nth stage capitalism, or its death throes, or how it might possibly eat itself and be gone. This is a must hear. It's going to be a good one. So just wanted to get that little plug out there.
Good tie into the intro that we did on Monday about late stage. So yeah, let's go ahead and share that. Real quick, I want to give a shout out to everybody who's joining this morning. Good morning, Mike Patino. Good morning, Mike Toller. Tommy John, welcome. Thank you. Always appreciate your comments. And if you're tuning in for the first time, we are obviously live and interactive, and anything could happen, and sometimes does. So if you want to weigh in on the conversation, you think we're absolutely wrong, or, I always post all the links to the discussion that we're about to have. So check our work. If you see something that maybe could be added to the conversation, or you have a different opinion and you can back it up, weigh in on the comments. We do see those and we do try to read them here. So I just want to get to some real quick. While you were talking, Andy, Patino saying time to transition to green technology power source. Yeah, and I gotta say, I am personally going through some of this right now. For those who don't know, and I hope to be taking you through this process, but I am technically homeless right now. And we purchased some land here in New Mexico where it's super cheap. So don't think that I have money. I don't. But we purchased some land with the intent of building a house. And it's not that we're hiring people to build a house. We are physically going to build this house. And part of it was we had to make a decision. Are we going to do an electric tie-in, or are we going to go off grid? And I had no intention of going off grid. But when I started doing the permits and checking the prices, just to take the electric from the road 20 feet onto the property was so expensive. I about fell out of my chair. And our entire budget for this project, we're sticking to a budget for a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house of $62,000. Everybody got that? That
Yes.
is an insane budget, but it's doable. This is part of why I want to take people through the project. But the other part of it that I had not figured on, I thought we were going to have to tie into electricity, but it was so expensive. And then I went out and got quotes for full on solar, so off grid. We're going with that, right? Because the price has come down so much, and you have US manufacturing and US suppliers, and there are some companies doing some really good things. I'm not going to mention them because, they're not sponsors, but they could be.
Good one. Good one.
Yeah. So, but it was just remarkable to me because I remember doing some pricing for our house in Illinois. That was a stick-built house, and we weren't there yet. So we went with replacing doors and windows. Now, a few years later, I was shocked and pleasantly surprised at what the entire setup is, from the power converters to the panels themselves, all the way down to now you can get lithium batteries, so you don't have to worry about acid. But anyway, I don't want to go too far into that, but it is becoming attainable for those of us who are at the low or middle income level. So this is where I really want to, if you are in oil and gas and you're working there, I'm pretty sure you're making a good salary right now, but that entire industry is, it's unsustainable. And you know yourself that your own job may be going away. Why live with that stress? Why not start to make that transition? And I know that in this state and in other states, you can get free education and training to start going over there and be early adopters in the tech and installation. So
Well, and quite honestly, the technology you're talking about has been around for so long, right? Even solar has been available to public for purchase for decades, right? Wind power, windmills. Remember the old pictures of the mills with the big wooden windmills on? That's not new. Right? We think of them as not usable because we have studies that prove that they kill birds or they make earthworms uncomfortable. Well, why is that? Well, most of those studies were funded by big oil and gas, right? And why would they want to say that renewable energy is bad?
Right. Exactly. There's an impetus there. So all right, more housekeeping. So in the interest of transparency, Andy, if you could put up this graphic. So if you saw an interview that we did last week, I think it was all the days are running together, but we had some folks who were with Movement for a People's Party who had left the organization. There's some dispute as to how that happened. I think they called it a purge. So I think they were removed from the organization, and we did an interview and walked through some of the things that they had described that happened to them and why they were a little disillusioned with the organization. And at that time, I had reached out to the leadership within Movement for a People's Party. Hadn't heard anything at the time of that broadcast, but I have since now gotten an email from Carol, who is part of their leadership team. And I had two questions for her. One, about the allegations that they were making. Did they care to address it? And two, there was another individual by the name of Laura Irwin who on social media and in other areas was making statements that she declared herself as a member of Movement for a People's Party, but then was also making statements as if she was part of the leadership team. So I just wanted to clarify her role with them. So in this email, and we posted it all across our social media, they addressed some of this. So we put it there for your consideration. And if you want to go back and watch that interview, just do with it what you will. But I was pleasantly surprised to see a response after seeing some posts, some pretty disturbing responses on social media, where it looked like one of the tactics they were going to take was coming after us, independent media, and other smaller outlets, calling out people, producers by name. That made me really uncomfortable, particularly if you're a progressive organization, you're organizing for progressives. Do you think you're going to get a fair shake with mainstream media? Or maybe you shouldn't burn your bridges with and take it out on progressive media. Just
right, exactly. And understanding what happened here, right? That as a news outlet or a media source, in an independent media source, people that had something to say, we gave them a forum to say it, right? Mm-hmm. We reached out on the other end and said, would you care to respond to this? Right? We heard crickets originally. we weren't judged. We were as unbiased as we could be in this interview. We didn't judge anybody. We didn't make any false claims, right? So that's the way that journalism used to be before corporations started buying up all the outlets, right? So this is why this is important. And they responded. Kudos to them. That's great. We've put the information out there. We're not going to editorialize it, but the information is now there for people to make up their own minds about what's happened or what is happening. So that's why that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Old school. And who would have thought publicly funded media would be, adherence to integrity? That's the way it's supposed to work. So Mike Toller was weighing in on the discussion we were just having about green energy, and it's a good point, and it really illustrates it well. He says, what did the buggy makers do when the car took over? Did they starve? No, they went into the car business. Absolutely.
Of course. Back before smart technologies and everything, when you remember the phone companies, before cell phones, before any of that technology, decades ago, when you used to pick up the phone and talk to an operator to process your call. You had these massive buildings filled with operators that were able to facilitate phone calls back and forth. What happened when the technology advanced to a point where those operators were no longer needed, right? Did those operators all starve and die? No, they went into other fields. They went into different jobs, right? This is a normal cycle in our in humanity, right? As technology progresses, some industries disappear and new ones arrive, right? This is why we always push back on a UBI as saying that the robots are taking over, right? That people will not have jobs. Well, you know what the robots are going to do? They're going to get rid of all the shitty jobs, right? They're going to get rid of all the factory jobs. It'll allow people to do things like planning their local neighborhoods and building parks and making improvements to infrastructure and installing solar panels on redheads in deserts that sometimes are colder than they used to be. The whole thing. That industry adapts. Human beings adapt, and they go into the service of other human beings, right? The better jobs that we should all look for in our society, right? You can't take a little bit of money and throw it at people and think that society fixes itself with all of the issues that you have just because you've got a little more money to give back to the capitalists. Right?
That's exactly right. So on that note, let's get into Yemen, because this is all about capitalism. Absolutely all about capitalism. So before we get started, and I'm not being disparaging. We know this is true. If you are an American, I want you to go and find Yemen on a map. And you can open book this one, use the Google machine, just pull up Yemen on a map, because when you see where this country is located, all of this is going to start to make more sense to you. Okay. So one of their primary exports is oil, but it's not a lot. It's really not a lot. So it's not that they have oil, it's where this country is located, which makes it a strategic asset to various superpowers. Okay, so we'll get started into this particular conversation. And because we're Americans and we have that exceptionalism and we don't really learn about other countries and backgrounds, and of course, corporate media has no vested interest in catching you up on why things happen. They just don't do a deep dive into the origin story of a particular issue. So this comes from the Biden administration saying that they are going to pull back in the U.S. involvement in the Yemen civil war. It's really not a civil war. Civil war is where you have two sides who have autonomy and they have a disagreement. That's not really what's happening in Yemen. And we'll go through what is happening, why it's happening, what we get from it, what we will continue to get from it, and why maybe you should care about all of this. But before I do that, it's that background that's important. And rather than me trying to go through it clumsily, I found an expert. This is a professor at Michigan State University who was born in Yemen. Her family's from Yemen. They are exiles from their country living here. And she did this really, I thought it was so great. There was a high school student who was doing a project, a senior project as part of Girl Scouts and her high school work, who invited the professor to do a talk on Yemen. So it was very elementary, but really insightful. So I included the link to the whole broadcast so you can go through and watch it. But this little excerpt, I think, sets up this conversation nicely. It's a little bit longer than what we normally do. It's about 4 minutes, but really, this is a good jumping off point. So this is Professor Shireen Al-Adeimi from Michigan State University, and she's the one who's taking us through kind of the foundational piece of how we got to where we are, because Yemen is a democracy. In the Middle East, they're not a monarchy, they're a democracy. So they didn't need American democracy. Why the hell are we there, right? So Andy, if you would mind, please go ahead and cue that one up.
For those of you who are not familiar with Yemen, it's where I was born. Its capital is Sana'a, and official language is Arabic. Before the war, over half of the population lived under $2 a day. So this is the country's, the Middle East's poorest country to begin with. And that explains, to a degree, some of the reasons why the war has had such a devastating impact on Yemen. Importantly, it's also the only country in the Arabian Peninsula. So our neighbors are Saudi Arabia, Oman, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE. And it's the only country among those countries who is a constitutional republic. So it's not a monarchy, it's not a sultanate, it's not an emirate. There's a strive for democracy, which is still ongoing in Yemen. That war is not over. Well, the North and the South decided to unite. And interestingly here, 1989 was when the Soviet Union was starting to crumble down, and Southern leaders were relying heavily on the Soviet Union's support, financial support. And so they began talks with northern Yemen. And, you know, I talked to my parents and they said the goal was always to unite the historic North with the historic South. So this wasn't a very unpopular idea at all. In fact, it's what most people wanted to see, a return to a united Yemen. Unity didn't last very long. By 1994, so it was united under the president of North Yemen, who was Salah. He had been ruling since 1978. And by 1994, the South declared secession from the North. The reason was, well, many Southerners felt like they were not represented in parliament. They won 18% of the seats in parliament. Maybe they had hoped for 50%, but again, they were 20% of the population. So that wasn't very surprising, but that was a huge point of contention. And many felt exploited by Northerners kind of moving in, and, you know, you'll hear this from many Southern Yemenis, taking over resources and whatnot. I think a natural consequence of the population disparity and the land disparity, but that was not expected. And so within 4 short years, the unity broke down. I lived through this declaration of secession, which resulted in a war. The North declared war on the South and kind of forced it back into unity through a summer war in 1994. The other major event was a series of events were between 2004 and 2010, and these were the Houthi Salah wars. Who are the Houthis? They call themselves Ansarullah, and the Houthi name itself is a family name. They are a family from northern Yemen. As you can see, this is the northernmost province bordering Saudi Arabia, and Sada. The province is called Sada. And they began, they practice Zaydi Islam, which is a version of Shia Islam that's different from mainstream Shia Islam. I think you only find Zaydi Islam in Yemen, but it's also not unique to the Houthis, because about 40% of Yemenis are Zaydis, including former President Saleh. They began with preaching against Saleh's corruption in Yemen, and as well as foreign intervention, not just militarily, but Saleh was a huge ally of the Saudis and the US, but also religiously. The Saudis were bringing in their version of Islam, Wahhabi Salafi Islam, and textbooks were changing, and the Zaydis were a prominent family with deep-seated, kind of rooted religious beliefs, and they didn't want that influence on their children and on other Yemenis. And so they began preaching against this kind of influence of Saudi Arabia in Yemen, as well as Saleh's corruption. I mean, the man was one of the richest men in the region, if not in the world, and Yemen was one of the poorest countries in the world.
Well, Carrie.
Yeah, I think she sets it up nicely, because from the prism of American thinking, if you were just hearing the news, corporate news talk about the Houthis, you might be tempted to think, oh, it's another ISIS group. No, it's not. It's not. It's so there are family regions, and it's just like my husband's. The barber name was Bannerman for. Just one family, right? So that's the Houthis. The Houthis it's a whole bunch of Smiths in one area. They're all related. Everybody's friendly with them. Yeah. So I love the way she sets up the context. And then again, reminder, this was a democratic area, a democratic republic area. They were not a monarchy. So what I thought was interesting is the previous ruler that she talks about. This is he was a 1%er, an oligarch, right? So you had this very, very poor area all across the country where parts didn't have running water, didn't have electricity. As I said earlier, don't confuse it with rural parts of Mississippi. This is Yemen. And yet you have a ruler and a ruling class who was hoarding all the wealth and resources. So obviously people were a little pissed. Right. And I think it was interesting when they originally did the march. She goes on to talk about it. Everybody from the South marched to the north to the capital and were unopposed. It was peaceful, which is another similarity to the United States. She also goes on to talk about how they are probably the most heavily armed populace next to the United States. So everybody has weapons there. Right. But it was a peaceful march on the Capitol, and they successfully removed this president, put him on house arrest, and they didn't kill him. They didn't torture him. They put him on house arrest, said, hey, guy, our families are in need and you are not doing what you want. So take from that what you will, right? So it reminded me, Andy, of that conversation we were having with Eddie about Scotland, because in the South, they only got so many seats available in their system there
In the parliament, yeah.
Yeah, and in the North, they took over all the seats. So what's going to happen if you don't have equal representation? Of course, you're going to feel, some type of way.
Right, right. And then it's all about the narrative, right? And the Yemen situation is just another, instance of that funny, not funny joke that says that what's the difference between a dictatorship and a democracy, right? A dictatorship is a country that won't allow the United States to drill for oil on its soil, and a democracy does.
Right. So Mike actually put that in the comments too. He's like, let me guess, it's all about oil. Sort of. And this is where it's interesting. So did you go and look up Yemen on a map? Yemen happens to be right on the tip next to that waterway. Do we know what's in that waterway? Right. So all the oil from all the other countries that we have helped democratize and whatever else, that's where all the oil tankers go. So Yemen is a strategic location because of the pathway for all the oil that we consume. And I forget what the old statistic was. It was a couple of years ago where the largest consumer of U.S. oil and oil reserves is our Navy, because 90% of our U.S. Navy's mission is protecting those tankers around the world, right? For us and for everything else. So think about it this way, if our military didn't have to protect those tankers, how much less oil would we need to purchase and consume in the United States? Yeah, so
All about the green.
right. So as I started going through this and I listened to, her entire conversation explaining how this was, so I was like, okay, what is going on here? If it's not for their oil, why are we there? So there are, we're part of NATO, and all of these from the different areas, Syria to Yemen, these are proxy wars. And if you look at US foreign policy, particularly in the Pentagon and things like this, the mindset is that if we are involved and support, then we will make sure that we are a dominant force because we are actually destabilizing some of those smaller countries. And repeatedly, over and over and over again, it's all about Iran. We don't want Iran to have influence and this sort of thing. So what I thought was interesting is this proxy war is us supporting Saudi Arabia. So it's Saudi Arabia who is in there trying to make sure that their guy, that president, remember that oligarch that we were just talking about, that he gets reinstated and his administration is reinstated. That's what they're trying to do. So just like we were doing in Venezuela, Saudi Arabia is doing that in Yemen. And by the way, we're allies with them and we supply hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of munitions and things like this. So one of our great corporations here, Raytheon, is actually supplying the majority of the munitions that are there. So here's the other really cool thing about Saudi Arabia. They outsource absolutely everything. And I was talking to some folks who are in this particular industry, and they were kind of chuckling about Saudi Arabia because they're like, yeah, all those pilots in the jets, like we sell them F-15s. Do you know who's actually flying that under the Saudi Arabia banner? Pakistanis. They're like, and I forget the statistic. I think I pulled it up, but it was like, oh, Andy, that was on one of those graphics. Hang on, I actually did this. So I forget all that was.
I forgot. I was smart.
Right. Well, I had a sleep, so
This is the What a Racket one, I think, with the graph on it.
No, this is the payoff. What's the payoff?
Oh, okay.
This has
One
the
second.
stat that I was reaching for.
Okay, I'll bring it up.
About. Okay, thank you. I'm totally out of order. I do this to Andy every time, just so you know. I
Don't
tell him
worry
what
about it.
order, and then I completely.
Good. It's not a big deal.
Okay, so yeah, I did pull the stats. So 70,000 Pakistanis serve in the Saudi Arabian military, right? And most of them are trained by us. And then on top of that, they have another 2 million Pakistani workers are working in just regular jobs in Saudi Arabia. And then I didn't pull the numbers, but I know that a ton of Filipinos are imported into Saudi Arabia for domestic work, like nannies and housekeepers and things like this. So Saudis outsource absolutely everything, import everything, including camels. They get camels from Australia. So yeah, because they're chilling on their oil. So of course, they're going to be particularly interested in Yemen and what's going on in Yemen, because again, look at where it falls on that map. So I just thought it was terribly interesting that we are involved because of Saudi Arabia, not necessarily because we need anything from Yemen. They don't need our democracy. We don't really buy oil from them. They actually export a lot of their goods and services to Asia, not to the West. So this is what's happening, and this is the background. So when you delve into this a little bit more, Andy, the next graphic, this is why it's important. And this one is about US arms sales. And I want to make sure that this particular chart may be a little hard to read, but when it compares US arms sales to Saudi and other countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, they're one of our biggest customers right now when it comes to arms sales. we are so far ahead of every other European nation. And so the first question I asked to a couple of these defense guys is, well, does that make sense, right? If we're spending so much money in development and discovery and advancing our own weapons and defense capabilities, why are we selling so much to other countries? I thought we couldn't do that, like helicopters and all of this sort of thing. And they said, well, we're not selling our best. No country actually sells their best to another foreign power. What happens is you might go back 2 or 3 years to a prior generation and sell that. Said, okay, all right, so it's maybe not the best, the latest technology. Said, but does that also give you the advantage that, well, I built this thing 3 years ago, so I know how it works. Therefore, I know how to break it should you use it against me. And they're like, yeah, kinda, yeah. so then the other thing that they brought up, and this is where NATO is kind of important and things get a little muddy, is the US is a member of NATO and so is Turkey. So they brought up the point of Turkey just made this huge purchase from Russia, who is not a NATO member, of a missile systems called the S-400s. And these are some really powerful, very intelligent guided rockets, which if you're in the US military or you're one of our allies, you're like, oh shit, right? And what they explained to me was, okay, so you had a NATO ally purchase from Russia this really cool missile system. They said, do you think that Russia is just going to leave that? Because Turkey is a NATO ally. If you're Russia, you know what's going to happen. The minute you complete that sale, deliver it, and walk away, there's going to be a bunch of American contractors just like us crawling all over it to dismantle it, figure out how it works and how to do counterterrorism and all of this sort of thing on the system. They said, so what Russia does, same thing we do. When we send equipment, whether it's 2, 3, 4 years old or worse, we also send US personnel. They're guarding it. Right. So when you look at the numbers about Army personnel, military personnel from America overseas at these bases, what they're actually doing is guarding our technology that we sold to these countries. So it's not just that we're making money off the arms sales, but we are also peopling their bases to protect our investment there too. So you get two of these things. And I wanted to explore that whole idea a little bit further. So I pulled up this really great article, and this is from the, let me make sure I've got it. And I put a link in here. It's a Congressional Research Service, and it was a report that was issued on November 23rd, 2020. And this goes back over a decade of US arms sales and what we're actually doing in places like the Middle East. They outline it. There's nothing hidden in here. They tell you exactly why we're in Syria, why we're in Yemen, why we're doing all of these arms sales, and it's not quite what you would expect. So the report itself is called Army Sales in the Middle East, Trends and Analytical Perspectives for US Policy. And as you go through it, it outlines the trends of where we were selling, and it's Yemen, Syria, Libya, all of our involvement. So as you're reading this, you're going to remember all these headlines that we saw, and the hashtag Forever Wars. This is it. This is the entire list of it. And they go through why we were involved there from a military standpoint. Their outside suppliers, who they work with, why Saudi Arabia is really important. So if you do nothing else, take this link, and this is the FAS.org, wonderful resource for all things military and what's going on. But this report in particular will tell you not only why the Biden administration is making the decisions they're making today, but it's also a pretty good predictor of what headlines you're going to see tomorrow. Okay, so in this, when you go down a little bit, they discuss the debate and, the tree huggers and all of that sort of thing, and the people who want to cut the budget, and they actually address that in there too. So the objectives, the intended objectives in this particular report, this is where it got interesting to me. I'm going to find the particular paragraph. Okay, so this would be on page 5. They get right into it. Here's why we're selling arms to Saudi Arabia, other countries, and why we are involved in these proxy wars. And this is directly from the report. And I quote, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have demonstrated an ability to project power beyond their borders with U.S. and other foreign support. But decades of U.S. arms sales and training have not created fully independent, logistically self-sufficient, integrated forces in any single Gulf country or across the Gulf as a whole. Did you get that? They're saying is, we are doing the work for them. We're making it easy for them to get fat and lazy, not understand how to do it, so they can flex all they want to, but we're the ones who are holding the keys. And because we have made it so easy for them, they can't do it on their own. So by being that nice guy, it's almost like the crack dealer. The first one's free.
Yep.
That's what's happened. So they go on to explain a little bit more, and I'm going to read just a little bit more here. So they said integrated forces in any single Gulf country or across the Gulf as a whole, a long-standing U.S. goal. So this has been for decades. We've been working on destabilizing their ability and sweeping the legs out from under them. They said, and I quote again, one former DOD advisor has criticized what he views as a U.S. policy approach that is overly focused on arms transfers and ignores building institutions to use those arms effectively. And this advisor writes, most of the United States partners in the region lack the defense institutional capacities that will enable them to become net security providers and better warriors, giving them more tools when what they really need to strengthen and sometimes even build from scratch their entire defense and security sectors is not going to do them much good. There you go. That is the reason for forever wars. They spell it out here and they go into more detail and they talk about all the programs and policies and why we have so many military members overseas. It's right there. So their entire goal, which you got to give them some credit, it's kind of worked, but it's also left us in a catch-22. So you have these major powers without military forces, and we saw this in Iraq, right? Iraq still cannot defend themselves. No matter how much training, money, and resources we put into the country, they are still not able to defend themselves. So now the U.S. has got to be there. Afghanistan, we're seeing the same thing, where there's all this time, money, resources. What is it now, 20 years? We've been there. They still cannot defend themselves. Same thing with Yemen and Syria and Libya and all of these things. So if you have a mind to remove us from these forever wars, now you have a bigger problem. This is a root cause analysis. So how are you going to get, number one, from a U.S. economy where 35 states in the United States, local economies depend on creating and producing military equipment and hardware? How do you get from that and then put this other piece in it where our entire foreign policy depends on destabilizing other countries' abilities to defend themselves? These two things together, now you understand why we have such a huge budget for the military and what the whole plan is.
And who benefits from that.
Right. Yeah. So this is also part of late stage capitalism.
Of course it is. Of course it is. It's when you get to the answers, when you can come to your conclusions, it's the exact same thing. The capitalists making money. It's all about that. It
Yeah.
means that America is better served going into these countries, destabilizing the governments that are in place, plugging in someone who is American friendly, who is a puppet of the American regime, that will allow them to come in and do all of these things, sell them the military hardware they need, that keeps all of those manufacturers happy, that keeps the oil flowing under American control, which keeps the fossil fuel industry happy, which keeps the budgets huge to all of the military personnel. But on top of that, all the contractors that make billions of dollars every year, and that keeps them happy.
Yeah. So the cycle
And we
just
just
goes on
yeah,
and on.
it's all about the cash. It's all about keeping. And why is Iran important right now? Well, Iran is really the only country in that region that the US has not been able to destabilize, right?
Nope.
Iran knew, and let's be honest about all of this. The governments and the people of those countries that mainstream media makes you think are basically just savages that have no ability to think critically of their own situations. They know what's going on. They live there. They see the Americans taking over and depleting all resources in those countries, and only making decisions and allowing bombing that kills civilians, right? Because it's good for business. And these countries don't have a recourse because they're not as strong militarily. They can't fight back, right? Because all the U.S. has to do is send in the troops, and it's all over for them. Again, why is Iran the country of interest right now for the U.S.? Because Iran was able to fight off the U.S. propaganda machine and the military, and strengthen themselves and become a sovereign region, right, that controls a lot of the oil. And that drives America crazy, because just think of the money we could make in a place like Iran.
Oh, absolutely. And I think shout out to the Iranian people, because I think in my entire lifetime, they've taken a decidedly different tack than other countries, probably because they are so far advanced in technology and things like this, despite all the sanctions that the world has put on them. They keep saying, and this is from the people, not necessarily from the government, the Iranian people keep calling out to American people and saying, we understand it's not you, we are with you, and we want you to be with us. It's our governments, right? And so that has the effect for a lot of people who are paying attention, going, maybe this isn't the right thing to do. Whereas you will see on U.S. propaganda channels, just like after 9/11, where they were celebrating in the streets and ISIS hates America. And there's enough imagery there to legitimize those claims, where the American people go, yeah, fuck those guys, we hate them. But that's not what Iran is doing. The people of Iran, we see them on social media and we can interact with them. And I have never met anyone who says, I hate you because you're an American. They always go to policy and government. So I think from a messaging standpoint, that works. It's working.
Right. Exactly. And like, without, I know we're kind of running out of time, but without getting too far into it, why does that matter in a place like Syria, right? And we understand that, or what we're being told by the propaganda machine of what's actually happening, and this is a bad guy, and Russia, and people don't realize that Syria, the country, went through a horrific 7-year drought, right, which devastated their economy, because they lost 40% of their food sovereignty because of this drought, right?
Yeah.
And when your debt is denominated in American currency, that means you have to get American dollars to pay your debt back. And if you can't, then that means that your country becomes a net importer, and your country suffers for it. And so all of this happened before any of the conflict that we now see in Syria. Well, why did the conflict in Syria happen? Well, the bad actors, like the United States, why never let a good crisis go to waste? Right?
Exactly. And to your point, getting back to Yemen just a little bit, I found this interesting. I could not find this in US media publications. I had to go out to BBC and Al Jazeera. Was anybody aware that the UN has sanctioned us yet again and sanctioned the world because Yemen is now facing an 80% of the population, 80% of the population will die. They are currently starving right now. 80%. So when you look at COVID and everything else and the rates, and people want to argue, oh, the flu, whatever, 80% of an entire country is starving right now. And nowhere in US news did I see this report. You have, and here it is from Al Jazeera, and I posted the link. UN raises alarm on dramatic deterioration in Yemen conflict. And when you look at the press report, right, this is a guy who is from the UN, he was sent to investigate, who's doing the report, his staff is doing the report. He is not from Yemen. When you watch this, you can see this guy's about ready to break down because it is that bad. And they are pleading with the world, particularly the United States and Saudi Arabia, knock it the fuck off. You are hurting people. And so while we go back and forth and say, oh, it's the Houthis did it. No, what's going on behind the scenes is us. That's us. And so you have all of these people who are starving and dying as a result, but yet all of this, again, if you go back to how this originated, they just wanted representation and they wanted some of their production to come back to them in the form of food and water and maybe a say in how their own government should operate. That was the crux of this. And now, as a consequence of where they are located, and because we have allies who want to control their government, 80% of their population is at risk of death within the next few months. We're not talking about this could happen sometime in the future. We're talking about right now. And so now you've got Syria, Libya, and Yemen. All of these places where they have raised the alarm to this level.
And unfortunately, they're trying to get reason from an oligarchical society in the United States that controls everything that happens in the region. And these people that are multi-billionaires that don't have an emphatic bone in their body are saying, why should I care about you people?
That's exactly right. And let's remember that just last week, was it last week or the week before, the Biden administration was not going to hold the crown prince responsible for butchering. I mean, they literally cut this guy apart in the U.S. embassy.
Well, sure. And why were the neoliberal Dems upset when Trump all of a sudden pulled Syrian American soldiers in Syria home, right? Well, that's not good for business. Yeah. Keep your eyes open to the current administration, and let's see how long it takes before those troops are sent back there.
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. So you're right, Annie, and that was the point of doing this entire segment, was because most of us don't get the news. It's hard to get the news. We're so busy trying to survive here, let alone understand what's going on in the world. But what is happening there absolutely affects you here, and you may not understand why. And this is why. And they're not trying to hide anything. Like I said, this is a publicly available report. They put it all in there. And oh, by the way, this is our 12th UN sanction and humanitarian violation in the last 5 years. So Yeah. So when they bring up that map, if anybody is going to redo that survey, when they talk about the biggest threat to world peace, and everybody picks the United States, here's why.
Except the United States.
Except the United States. We picked some arbitrary, who was it this week? Right. So
New Zealand.
those damn Kiwis.
Those damn Kiwis that think that money grows on trees.
Right. Exactly. So so I hope that everybody who tuned in this morning, you've learned something from this, and maybe it gives you something to think about as we go forward with, oh God, I hate to keep saying it, but it's the war machine. And this in, again, Andy, you brought it up, you said it accurately. It's late stage capitalism requires being fed by, genocide and war and all of these things. And here it is. So
Yes. Maybe as a conclusion, you can ask yourself, I think that you understand that the American government really doesn't care about Black and brown people in their own country. Why would they possibly care about them in other countries?
Exactly. Well said. So yay, Wednesday. So sorry to bring you down, but we have to do a reality gut check on this particular issue. So I appreciate you tuning in. For everyone that was in the comment section, it's so funny because as we get started, everybody is Twitter on our Twitch stream, black screen. Sorry about that. I will go out and check our Twitch stream, see what happened there. Maybe I'll fix it. But for everyone who tuned in, it's funny because everybody starts out so happy, and then when we get to a serious topic, they get real quiet. I can see they're still there, but they're just real quiet. So it's okay. Buck up, little camper. It's just information.
We just want to get the information out to you, and we want it to be thought provoking. We want people to make the bridges to reality. Right. This is why it's important that part of your journey to understanding what needs to happen to make our world that we live in a better place. This is the journey, right? We can lead you there, but you've got to ingest it. And hopefully, our tens and tens of watchers can understand that.
That's exactly right. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Andy. And we will be back on Friday, and still have no idea what we're talking about. Maybe Andy could give us a topic for Friday. So
we'll
work on it.
Sorry.
Nice. All right.
Nice try though.
I know, I was trying. All right. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you back here on Friday. Andy, final words of wisdom for us.
Two things. First of all, never pet a porcupine, and never put out a campfire with your face. My words of wisdom today. You guys enjoy your day, and we will see you on Friday. Take care.
We bout that, ayy. We in the zone. We out here, yeah. Spitting the facts, how it's supposed to be. Hair of the dog, we keeping it G. Whoa, oh, oh.